After I did a video a while back about how to get started in airplane ownership, I've had several messages about why did Corey and I select our Saratoga versus other airplanes in the PA32 series like the Cherokee Six, the Lance, or the XT. Today I'm going to give you a little tour of our 1981 fixed gear Saratoga, and I'm going to talk about the entire PA32 series of aircraft and give you some details of just some of the differences in those models. So our Saratoga is a 1981 turbocharged model, specifically with fixed landing gear. And we were specifically looking for a fixed gear version because when we purchased this airplane, I only had about 250 hours of total time. Most of those hours in a 1965 Piper Cherokee that I was in a partnership with two other guys. But the big factor was that we lived in Angel Fire, New Mexico. So when I say that, people always ask me, why does the airport make a difference? Well, Angel Fire is a county-owned airport with a massive 8,900 by 100-foot runway. But what makes it unique is that the airfield is the nation's fourth highest public use airport. Field elevation was 8,380 feet MSL. More importantly, because of the location of the airfield right in the middle of the valley, the runway is oriented to the north and south, but the winds are predominantly from the west. And when I say winds, I am talking about some serious winds. So that always leads to the comment that every landing in Angel Fire is a crosswind landing. Because I was such a low-time pilot, and knowing that every landing that I had whenever I came home was going to be a crosswind, we wanted to lessen our insurance costs and do everything we could to minimize the costly mistakes that might come about from any side loading of the gear. Yes, we would lose a few knots in cruise flight, but we had lived in Bethel, Alaska for 4 years, and the Saratoga and their fixed gear version is very robust, and we knew that from our time of flying in and out of the bush. Because we had a couple of hundred hours in the normally aspirated 1965 PA28 Cherokee, we also knew that we needed to have a turbocharged airplane. Even knowing how to properly manage our mixture and our takeoff procedures for our high density altitude environment, there were times that just myself and Corey in the airplane, with minimal baggage and half tanks of fuel, the best takeoff performance that we could get out of it was about 200 feet per minute. And there were plenty of days that we just didn't fly because it was too risky because of the downdrafts coming off the mountains and the potential performance. We knew that having a turbocharger in our next airplane would allow us to generate full engine power all the way up to 17,000 feet in the case of the Saratoga, giving us more capabilities to use the airplane for our year-round mission of actually traveling to family and going to take vacations. I'm about to get more into the details of the PA32 series of aircraft, but if you think that I'm exaggerating any of this mission-specific stuff at all, or if you're simply considering a flight to Angel Fire, I have a link down in the description below with a safety video about flying in and out of there. You might find it interesting. But back to the airplane. I'm going to start off showing you the plane, which as I mentioned is a 1981 fixed gear turbo Saratoga. Designation is a PA32 301T Tango. So for those that have never flown a Piper airplane, one of the things that catches people's attention off the bat is this stabilator here on the back of the aircraft versus a traditional elevator that many of you have seen on your 172s that are used in many of the flight schools. The size of this stabilator gives responsiveness even at slow airspeeds, particularly for an airplane of this size and weight. This airplane has Piper's semi-tapered wing with a wingspan of 36 feet 2 inches. We'll talk more about the tapered wing versus the Hershey bar wing here in a little bit. The tapered wing has a little bit better performance, and I think it looks a little bit better. This particular model has some wingtip speed mods and also some additional lighting in the wingtips that were added aftermarket. I didn't do it, previous owner did. The flaps have 3 positions that extend out as far as 40 degrees, controlled with the Johnson bar. Now, I personally like the Johnson bar because of its simplicity, the ability to instantly manipulate the flap position, and the fact that an electrical failure doesn't impede the operation of the flaps. Saratogas built after 1985, though, those were changed to electric flaps. This airplane is a 6-seater with club seating in the back. Now, there are some of these model planes out there that have seating for 7. There are also variants where all of the seats face forward. We particularly wanted club seating in our plane. And so we were able to find this in this particular aircraft. But one thing we were not able to get was air conditioning. If we had air conditioning in this aircraft, the condenser, the fan, and other equipment would be behind this bulkhead. Since we don't have AC, the only thing behind the bulkhead in our case is the battery. This is the original analog autopilot system, and also the oxygen system is back here. There are some owners that have purchased and installed a kit that allows you to actually extend this baggage compartment further into the tail cone as well. In the way that our plane is configured right now, notice the amount of space between the pilot and the co-pilot seat. Traditionally, we would have this center console with this cooler here installed. Since Corey and I have been doing a lot of traveling, just the two of us for our last several trips, we've removed the console by pulling out these two bolts. This allows Corey to very easily move from the front right seat to the rear of the airplane while we're flying if she wants to stretch her legs or get into the cooler and make a snack on those longer flights. The seats back here are easily removable by the owner, so any different number of configurations are available. But just to note, you do need to have a weight and balance for each of those different configurations that you might fly. There are plenty of times that we take out all the seats if it's just the two of us and we're doing a multi-week-long trip somewhere. There are also times that we'll take our son and our daughter-in-law with us on a trip, and here are some pictures of us loading up for a 10-day ski trip with skis, boots, helmet, ski clothes, all of those things for 10 days. The beauty of this configuration is that in the cabin, you can easily fit even the longest skis against the far side and still have seating available for passengers right next to the egress doors. Of course, this always brings up the question about useful load. This particular airplane has a useful load of a bit over 1,300 pounds. For a trip with 4 adults and realistic baggage, loading within the weight and balance envelope is not a problem. If we need to do more than 4 adults, sometimes we will need to lose a little bit of fuel to stay under max gross weight. After 1979, Piper simplified the fuel system on their PA32 series to have just 2 tanks. So our particular airplane is 107 gallon capacity, 102 usable. This airplane is also equipped with GAMI turbo injectors and a JPI engine monitor. That allows me to run the plane lean of peak and still keep my cylinder head somewhere between the 350 to 375 range. The result of that is a fuel burn of about 14 gallons an hour at 65% power. Our practice when we go on a flight with our friends is to weigh everything and all of the gear, get a real weight and balance. Then I will fuel up all the way to max gross weight. The least amount of fuel I've ever had to take off with on our trip is 70 gallons, which is about 3 hours and 15 minutes of fuel with a 1 hour reserve. Yes, I know VFR requires only a 30-minute reserve, but Corey's personal minimums require a 1 hour reserve on all flights, so I'm going to honor that. Reality is, on a long trip with other people in the airplane, about 3 hours of flight time is good enough to land and take a break and give everybody a stretch of the legs. If it's just Corey and I in the plane, we can fuel up completely, fly a 4.5 or 5 hour leg, still land with the appropriate reserves. One thing about the fuel system that I want to mention for those of you accustomed to flying Cessnas or other high-wing aircraft, notice that there's no both on the fuel selector. The reason for this is that because a high-wing airplane has gravity helping feed the fuel towards the wing roots and into the plumbing going down into the engine. But because this is a low-wing airplane, gravity isn't helping us here. The engine-driven fuel pump sucks the fuel from one wing or the other, and my personal practice is that I will switch tanks left or right throughout the flight, always within gliding distance of an airport, just in case, and managing the fuel so that I land appropriately balanced between the left and right tanks depending on where I have things loaded in the aircraft. As a note, if you look at earlier model PA32s, you can find airplanes that have had their avionics upgraded and their vacuum systems removed that are 1,500 and approaching 1,600 pounds of useful load. Later model PA32s, those planes received more upgrades, better insulation, all of these new things, and those upgrades had more weight, which resulted in less useful load. So when considering a PA32 series plane, be sure to check out that actual aircraft's weight and balance documentation to see what kind of useful load you might get. Now, while we're on this topic of avionics, this airplane received significant upgrades in the early 2000s, but compared to today's modern glass panels, this panel looks antiquated. This airplane has both Garmin 530W and 430W WAAS-enabled GPS receivers. Also has this MX20 display, all connected to a GDL69, so I do have Sirius XM aviation weather and data. The autopilot is the original Century 41 analog autopilot, but it does allow for full navigational pairing with the Garmin 530. It'll fly both radio-based and RNAV approaches. It does feature attitude and altitude hold features. We don't have a flight director, and we don't have the ability to fly a specific vertical speed or do flight level capture, FLC, if you're accustomed to a G1000. You can set your attitude and the airplane will maintain that particular attitude, but you have to monitor your airspeed and adjust manifold pressure as you climb and do those types of things. As for flying an instrument approach, yes, it will fly the glide path and the localizer on an ILS. It will also do the vertical navigation on an RNAV as well. I'm often asked why I haven't upgraded the avionics in the airplane, and to be perfectly honest, the avionics work well, knock on wood. And I've only had to spend about $500 total in avionics maintenance since I bought this airplane in 2019. And since Corey and I have moved into an air park and we built our dream house and this hangar that I'm in right now, there simply isn't $40,000 or $50,000 in the budget for an upgrade that really doesn't gain us any additional capabilities. Reality is, I can safely and effectively fly IFR, even with complex stars, all the way to minimums with this avionics configuration. From a performance perspective, because of its size, the Saratoga is not a speedy bird. My analogy is that you might think of a Mooney as being a two-seat sports car, a Cirrus or a Bonanza as being a BMW, and the Saratoga is like being in a Tahoe or a Suburban, a large SUV. Yes, you give up some speed, give up some agility for the ability to carry a lot of gear in a wide variety of configurations, all within the weight and balance envelope. But the controls are a bit heavier, and if you consider that compared to a luxury vehicle, if you were driving an SUV, you would feel that as well. I am a pretty hefty guy. I don't care for being in an airplane where I'm literally rubbing shoulders with whoever is sitting in the right seat. So that removed many planes from our consideration. Reality is, don't base your decisions on a particular aircraft platform strictly based on specifications. You really need to go and fly the different types of planes. As another analogy for you, when Corey and I go to a restaurant, we love to sit at a high top or the bar. That's our preference. It's what we like. But we have some friends that they hate to sit at the bar. They only want to sit at a low table, never a high top. It's okay to have a preference. And the only way you know what you're really going to like is to actually try the variants that are out there that you might want to consider. In our plane at 65% power, I get 155 knots true consistently when below 10,000 feet. And I've gone on trips with friends that have Moonies, and while they might beat me to the destination by 10 or 15 minutes, I'm the one usually carrying their cargo if we're going on a long trip. For our mission, this is the airplane for us. Corey and I have both been asked over the years, what will be your next upgrade? And honestly, I can't imagine a need to change airplanes. People ask about getting a Malibu or a Meridian. We have built-in oxygen in our plane, and I've taken her up to 18,000 feet only a couple of times, really to take advantage of some awesome tailwinds. So pressurization isn't something that we need. I don't feel that a turbine's expense is something we want to tackle. And it's really wonderful to have an airplane that fits our mission so well and truly gives us joy to own and use. For the second half of this video, I want to talk a bit about the different variants of the PA32 series. The reason for this is that there have been variants of the PA32 going all the way back to the mid-1960s. There are some things that anyone looking at these aircraft should know. I don't know that any one feature makes a particular model better or worse than another. It truly depends on your mission, your budget, and what you like. Now, I'm not going to get into a full history, getting down to all of the variants, but I will try to give you a primer and talk about the things that I feel are important to note. Also, to avoid confusion, I'm not going to get into some of the nuances of the names like the Lance versus the Lance II, or the Saratoga versus the Saratoga II, or the Saratoga HP. If you are interested in all kinds of detail like that, there's some videos out on YouTube that go into that detail. And there's also a great book by Ron Smith called Piper Cherokee, A Family History. And it has all of that kind of detail that you might want. So the PA32 series began back in the mid-1960s when Piper received type certification for the Cherokee Six in March of 1965. These planes were designated the PA32 250 and the PA32 260. These were built on the original Cherokee design. They stretched it in length and width, and they put in a Lycoming 0540 six-cylinder engine. Because these airplanes were widened, I believe it was about 7 inches, and they were lengthened behind the wing about 30 inches, it changed up the weight and balance and required that the engine be moved forward. Piper accomplished this by adding the forward baggage bay, which is truly an awesome addition. In my plane here, I'll give you a view of this. You can actually get a pair of golf clubs into this forward bay, which is awesome. In the back, the original Cherokee Sixes, they had seating for 7. Max gross weight in these early PA32s was about 3,400 pounds. And I've talked to plenty of owners who have moved to modern avionics, and those guys were seeing 1,350 to 1,400 pound useful loads, even with the 3,400 pound max gross. The 260 horsepower versions of the Cherokee Six were in production all the way through 1978. Now, it's worth noting that about a year after Piper came out with the PA32 250 and 260, they started building 300 horsepower versions of the plane. But other than the horsepower, the 260, the 300 horsepower versions are pretty much all the same. When Piper decided to make a Cherokee, PA28, which is a Cherokee, they decided to make that with a retractable gear, they changed the name to the Arrow. And this gave them the opportunity to introduce a retractable gear 6-seat airplane that would compete more with the Bonanza. This first PA32R series, the R being for retractable, carried the name Piper Lance. Because the retractable gear carried a weight penalty, Piper made some refinements in the design that allowed the max gross weight to increase from 3,400 pounds to 3,600 pounds. This gave a little bit over 100-pound useful load advantage to the Lance over the Cherokee Six, even with the added weight of the retractable gear. Now, as we all know, the 70s, that was a time of experimentation with a lot of things, and airplanes aren't any different. In 1978, Piper designed the Lance II that had a T-tail. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of the T-tail design in the PA32, but I will say that fellow PA32 pilots that own the T-tails, they love them. They have a very distinctive look to them, and the T-tail is tall, and it's really convenient when the airplane is hangared. Like all things, it really depends on your taste. For those of you that have flown early Cherokees, many of you during your primary flight training, the distinctive Hershey bar wing is the same wing that you'll find on the Cherokee Six and the Lance models. One thing that's worth mentioning about these early model PA32s is that it had a 4 fuel tank system that needed to be managed correctly during flight. I've only flown in one of these planes and the management isn't difficult, but given the number of general aviation accidents that we've seen over the past couple of years that have been caused by fuel starvation, I feel it's worth mentioning since obviously pilots are not learning this appropriately. In 1980, Piper changed the wing design from that traditional Hershey bar wing to what is called their semi-tapered wing design. Now, this required some strengthening of the wing, and it increased the wingspan to a little over 36 feet, which is about a 3-foot increase from what the Cherokee Six was. This also changed up the fuel system design, allowing an increase of the fuel capacity to 107 gallons with only 2 tanks to manage versus 4 tanks on the earlier versions. The new name for this version of the PA32 was the Saratoga. There were fixed gear and retractable gear versions. Both were available with normally aspirated and turbocharged engines. And they still had the IO 540, the injected Lycoming 540. And it was a 300 horsepower engine. These Saratogas were in production from 1980 all the way through 2009 with minor refinements to the cowling and the window design over the years. After 2003, if you're looking for a fixed gear version, you'll see these marketed as the 6X or the 6XT. I've got a buddy of mine in Angel Fire that has an amazing example of a 6XT. For anyone that's in the market for a 6-seat general aviation piston airplane, I would encourage you to consider the PA32 series. There's a very active and helpful group of owners and PA32 fans on Facebook, and you can find that by searching for Piper PA32 Six Saratoga and Lance Owners and Pilots. With that, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to hearing any questions or comments that you might have, and here's to seeing you out on the ramp somewhere.